back to Product World Main Stage. I have our next speaker of the day here with me. This is Chris Butler, the Product of Operations or Operations for GitHub.
Hey, how's it going? Well, thank you everybody for being here. I wanted to talk a bit about the idea of culture and values, and especially the way that, say, product operations can help with those types of issues. So to get started, I'd like to talk about the idea that there's a lot of different places where they may have like an internal and external page that outlines the values that they actually think about and use a lot within their worlds. And I guess before we get started, I want to show you a page of values. And this is a place that I used to work at. But I would love to hear if anybody can guess in the chat, in the comments, which company this actually is. I'll give a second here. So a few of the values here are work is one, raise the bar, dare to innovate, do the right thing, and own it. And so can anybody guess what company these values are actually for? So I've gotten previously people saying things like, it might be Uber because of the little directional thing right there. I see someone says Apple. No, Apple would probably be a better designed website than this. Any other guesses? Another one that I've gotten is Google. And again, like they would probably have a lot more of like red, blue, and yellow and green, all the different colors that they usually use. A cell phone company. Okay, yeah, no, it's not a cell phone company. So I'll let you stop guessing, but essentially this is the value set for Cognizant. And so I spent about a year there as AVP of product operations for a product management group of about 120 people. And what I would say about this is that I'm not sure it's really as impactful as they want it to be. And part of the reason why is if I don't look at the screen right now, I probably couldn't really tell you what the values were, and I probably never really applied them. And actually, when I prepared this presentation later, they were originally at about 6 values, but then moved to 5. And I couldn't tell you which ones were actually removed or changed. And the reason why this is a problem is that values are a way to not only market to new employees about the way that they should think about working there, and acclimating them to the way that people do the work, but also the fact that internally to these companies, they have expectations about the way people do work or work with each other. And usually that's kind of shown through the values. Unfortunately, I would say that more often than not, these values are more like platitudes or aspirational or something that is not real. And the reason why a lot of the time, just kind of like good strategy is that there's not really a good way to trade off or to talk about how these things interact with each other and what is potentially behavior that is also good behavior that we would choose over this. And so, for example, doing the right thing, would there ever be a time that we wouldn't want to do the right thing? Or is there ever a time that we should own it? And so these ends up being, like I said, just mostly platitudes rather than things that can actually be helpful in all the different circumstances I just talked about. And I guess the question is like, how do you actually use these within hard decision making within the org anyways? And more often than not, people don't use them at all. And one group I do want to bring up really quickly is this is the Agile Manifesto. And what I think is really powerful about the Agile Manifesto is the fact that they're actually showing that there are 2 possible things here, say individuals and interactions or process and tools. And you can imagine that some teams may want to choose process and tools over individuals and interactions. But in this particular case, they're being very purposeful to say that, while these are both good options, this is the one that we're usually going to choose here when we talk about the Agile Manifesto. And so what these are often called are even overstatements. And I found them to be very valuable, not only in strategic discussions, because it's helping provide the kind of shape of the way we make decisions, but also the fact that inside of values, what the values actually help us do is make those decisions in a day-to-day point of view. And so this takes us to, I'd say that values tend to be a component of culture. But in reality, culture is a pretty big word. It can mean a lot of different things. And so when I think about culture, I really get the main definition from this book. And what you'll find is that I have a lot of recommendations for books in here. And I think they're all really good to be able to understand more about how do you build culture inside of an organization. There will be a QR code and a link at the end to be able to get access to the list of all these things, including the slides, show up feedback form. But I think this book really does a great job of really outlining a definition that I think is really functional for understanding culture. And that is that organizational culture is at root the residue of perceived success. And what that says to me is what it really means is how do people think that others are successful here? How do they see behavior that is successful that then allows them to model behavior? And so some of the times that could be values, but more often than not, it's observing the organization, seeing how leaders act, and what they actually tend to see as success or valuable within that organization. And so the problem is that culture really is emergent. It is something that leaders may write a document that tries to say, here is what the culture is going to be going forward. But in reality, what ends up happening is they have to set the environment. And so there's three things I think that play into this environment. One is who are the people that are being hired, who's being fired, who's being laid off. These are all things that kind of really at the most basic level show people what you consider to be successful and who you want to be there. There are incentives, and that could be not only just getting promoted, but this idea of kind of soft incentives like getting kudos, who's actually getting visibly punished or out in public being told that they're not doing the right thing. And then finally, the values that we're talking about. And this could include things like goals, this could include things like strategy. But the reality is like, what are we really trying to point the organization towards and how do we help them make decisions in some way? And so the truth is that inside of all of these things, leaders don't actually set this culture. They end up creating the conditions through these different aspects to actually create the culture that ends up existing. And I think this takes us to the next kind of concept is like, well, so if they are setting up these environments or these conditions for a culture, what is the culture in itself? And I would say that inside of this book by Stan Slap called Under the Hood, they do a really good job of talking about how organizations are really more like a complex organism that is really all of the different people that are involved are kind of forming a shared memory and understanding about what is happening based on the way the leaders end up interacting with the organization as a whole. And I think there's a longer quote here, but I think what's really most important about this is that it is all about this fact that the organism is constantly watching for signals from the leaders and from the people that are considered to be leaders inside that org. And in particular, what is most kind of concerning, I think, for the culture is that it needs to help serve itself. And a lot of the time that self-service is to be able to survive, to be able to, be happy and maybe be calm in the sense of how they're then delivering their work. And so when we think about the organization as a whole, then that means that we need to understand that the leaders really have a huge impact on the way that people interpret the culture of that organization in itself. And it's not just the fact that they say they set conditions, but they also need to be role models and actually live and do by what they say are the most important aspects of the values. And so that then takes us to this next kind of discussion, which is, how do we actually start to say there's a set of values that we have, and we now want to in some way make the culture be more, in alignment of the way that those values are espoused, because we believe that those values will actually create a better culture. And so there are three things I want to talk about. The first of which is the listening tour, which is the listening tour is really about how, as a product operations person, I see part of my role as helping leaders really figure out what is going on with the team, even though they may have limited ability to get information from them, partially because of power structures, but also partially because people don't want to necessarily give hard feedback to senior leaders. And so within this, the listening tour is really about, I did this most recently in November, where I interviewed about 20 something PMs, and did it earlier in March of last year as well, where I did something like 28 PMs that were part of the team. And what we did was actually go after a couple key questions. And the key question I always start off with is, what is it just like? Like overall, what is the lived experience around this? I think the key question that is related to that idea of the original definition of culture is really, what is success here and how do people see that? And sometimes I've been in teams where the majority of the people will frankly answer that they don't know what is actually success here. And that shows that there's maybe like a pretty big discrepancy in what they claim to have as values versus the values that are actually practiced on a regular basis. And same thing with failure. Failure can be one of those things where there's a lot of different ways you can fail, but they tend to also look at least from what I've found, to not necessarily be about the individual. Like, definitely, people may get through the hiring process that are not a match in some way for the level of rigor that the organization may require. But what I've found is that generally those failure cases end up being in some way that the organization is actually constructing contexts or places for those people to then do their work that is not helpful for them getting their work done. And so the failure is a great example of, like, there are also systems and processes and tools and the organization as a whole that maybe are beyond values that also we want to understand how we can make those types of things better. And then finally, I always end up finishing off with, like, what are the three wishes that you do use to change anything? And this is not so much about like the specifics that they would change, but really, kind of what are the non-surface level things that those particular wishes point to. The next thing is really, once we start to identify and understand the way people think about the values within the organization, and then we have some espoused values or aspirational values that we then want to live up to. Um, we can then use like workshops within kind of group context to be able to understand now what can we do to bring the aspirational values more in line with the reality of the world for the team. And one of the things that I did in a offsite kind of middle of last year for the PM team was take them through a couple different exercises, one of which is the Ideal Present Canvas by Jay Bloom, which really kind of talks to the idea of how do you get an understanding of like what are the worst case scenarios for things, what are the best case scenarios, and then taking it back to the point of like if we want all of the good case scenarios and we don't want the bad case scenarios for the future, how do we start to build like how do we create a list of things that we could do to actually move us towards the good and away from the bad? And what we do is basically once we started to ideate all that, we can go into other exercises to then prioritize. And this is one that's called SUI mapping by Dave Snowden, which is really all about how do we start to look at like the time and energy to make change in things. And so you can see that the vertical is energy and the horizontal is time. And the things in the upper right hand corner, we maybe don't want to have to deal with because of the fact that, or we can't deal with because there's so much time and energy. It's kind of almost the water that we swim in that will take a very long time to change. And so we tend to not focus on those types of changes. And then the things in our bottom left hand corner, maybe even the negative, where we're not even applying energy or time and it just happens anyways, really end up being these things that are highly volatile and that we can't really control. But there's this middle band, and especially the ones that are maybe a little bit more energy but less time, where we can start to then create really experiments that allow us to understand how could we make a change to our organization and how could we make an impact to then bring the current real values of the culture in alignment with the aspirational ones that we have as an organization. And so then after that, I think there's things that are inside of the processes that we will take on as part of a team that are beyond this idea of like, okay, we figured out a bunch of things that we need to do. One of the things that I found to be highly actionable when it comes to culture and the values is really to use small micro moments within the team, which usually is through like status reporting. And by the way, I've probably helped launch and iterate 5 or 6 different types of status reporting throughout my career. They all kind of fail in similar ways. Usually it's because of the fact that senior leaders are not going to model the behavior that they want from their people on their team. But I found that there's actually a huge benefit to using even something as simple as a status to be able to then reinforce values. And so giving very, very simple kudos to people about why this is a great thing and how it's in alignment with the values that you really think about can be highly impactful in the way that they start to then internalize those values. I would say that asking lots of great questions in service to those values inside of these statuses are really great too. And then finally, if you do need to, critique or actually give harder feedback, that needs to happen in a more private place. But at the very least, being able to just give very, very easy kudos to people. And what this does is it creates a two-way street for statuses where we may not have had that previously. And I think that's really powerful. So those are 3 things that I think we do. But now what I want to talk about is not just this idea of how can we get change, but should we have change in some way? And so this is the next book. Actually, the next thing I wanted to ask you is maybe when I talk about like an organizational blender, what do people think that means? Maybe in the comments. So what is the blender? If I tell you that there's a blend, an organizational blender in some way, any ideas? Well, so the blender, the way that this particular author, Ashley Goodall, talks about it in The Problem of Change, is that often for there to be change in culture and change in strategy because of things like Conway's law, people will tend to think that you actually have to then reorg the team, make a lot of change in the way that they do different types of processes and tools. And the issue will be in the fact that change actually causes the team members to then be unmoored from the other people that they've created social connection with. And this is really bad. And Ashley really tries to make this point that in the end, what is really most important is that we need to make change when we know it's a good thing, and we should stop making change for change sake. Because the idea of, say, a reorg, moving this team to over here or breaking apart this team and moving them over here actually creates so much discord for those people that you're basically starting from scratch in some ways once you do that. And so I would ask, like, how do we actually find this right balance? How do we maybe create frictions that stop us from making too much change for people, but making the right amount of change in a way that they can then adapt over time so that the organism itself can actually adapt and understand and not get scared in some way. And then finally, there's not only this issue about should we change, but does actual alignment around a set of values actually help us in some ways? And the reason why this is interesting to me is because of this paper that came out back in the 1986. And this concept of dominant logic is about the fact that when senior leaders end up becoming very successful as they get promoted, they continue to basically look at the mental models or the framings that they've used previously, the processes that they've used previously, and then use them in their current situation. But the problem will be that even though those things may have been successful in the past, they may not be successful in the current environment and in the current situation. And so this dominant logic ends up kind of filtering out other possibilities. It ends up kind of creating a calcification about the way that decisions are made, especially at the top, because of the fact that if they've been successful to get to that point, they're not going to consider other ways of doing things. And so in this particular case, if we have a set of leaders, even if we have kind of information passing down, say maybe through asks for alignment or strategic documents, requests to do things, what we have as we start going back up is we have information about what is going on the ground within those teams, with customers. And what can be really bad about this is that inside those cross-functional teams, even though they're trying to pass up information that is valuable, there may be information that needs to be shaped by that manager. So if an IC says that they're blocked, that will be some type of shaping that they end up doing at a manager level to get to the leader, because maybe the leader is really not necessary. It's not necessary for them to know about that block at this point, because there's nothing they would do about it, and it would just cause more noise for the team. But the other issue is that you're also then filtering ideas as they go up in the organization. And that filtering based on dominant logic then reduces the variance over time. And so what that does is, because we then also have a strong need for alignment when it comes to the way that information is passed down in the organization, and the filtering of information going back up doesn't allow for the variance of things that are happening, you end up getting almost overaligned. And I would say that this is potentially a symptom of things like groupthink, which can happen to teams that are, getting along with each other, but are maybe not considering all the possibilities outside of like what their current viewpoint or dominant logic is in some way. And so this maybe takes us to another question, which is, how much as product operations people, as teams, should we be actually scaling our leaders when it comes to helping them with their culture? And is it really that in some way, what we're trying to do is we're trying to actually build a system that is about culture and values that transcend any leader in particular? And I think that this is where we end up getting very confused. A lot of the time, product operations people, if they're reporting to a senior leader, they will have to basically they'll be asked to do things the way that they want to do them, rather than trying to do what is best actually for the people that are on the team and the way that that organization may work longer term. And that's why values and culture end up being such a kind of ideally a more durable set of ways of doing work that may evolve over time, because people come and go, the market needs are may change over time. But the reality is that creating some type of durable, sustainable culture and set of values is really uh, not just about that leader, but about everybody on the team. And so, in closing, and I want to open this up to some questions, I think really what we're trying to do is that values are really a decision model here, and that you should be not only trying to set aspirational ones, but you should be understanding what are the actual working decision models within the team today. And the culture itself is really what is perceived success. And what you want to do is create a healthy culture, is to actually connect what are the espoused values with what is perceived success and reward for them in some way. And that means that also leaders will then model that behavior. And those leaders then set the conditions for the team. But in the end, if they don't do what they say, and they don't model those behaviors, and in fact, maybe they should not even ask for the team to do the things that they're doing. They should just be doing them and rewarding people that do them. The idea of like what is a culture or organization will almost take care of themselves. And so with that, I want to say thank you, and I'll take some questions. And then also here's just like a link to a list of all of the resources. And oh, I can't seem to post to the comments for some reason. But you can get a list of the books that are there, and then also I'd love to get any feedback that you have about the talk that I just gave. So thank you. I'd love to hear any comments or questions. Oh, thank you, Austin. All right, let's see here. One of the questions that did come up earlier is how do you find out what's under the hood prior to joining the team? This is actually a really hard question. I would argue that when it comes to the way that we understand things like tacit knowledge, which is really about intuition, there's a bunch of types of tacit knowledge, like physical tacit knowledge, like learning how to play a sport. There's kind of mental model tacit knowledge, which is about like learning mental models and framing. But the one that we're actually best at is actually organizational tacit models, where because we're so focused on the way that we end up kind of interoperating with other people, just because of the way that we've evolved over time, we have a good intuition once we get started within a team. So that's the hard part, is that to really understand this. This is why I think it's interesting about the term like honeymoon phase inside of organizations, is that the honeymoon phase is that maybe you have an unrealistic expectation of a culture, and now you have a realistic one. And maybe it's not 100% match with your goals or the way you like to do work, but you want to hopefully have enough overlap that it's not a problem for you to work there. What I would say though is that whenever I do talk to people in a new team, I do ask them that question: what is success and failure here? And asking that of all these different people, if you then start to look at things like if they have an external values page, if you start to then cross check that with the way that people talk about that, and which will be highly edited, by the way, because you're in an interview, I think that's super helpful. And then looking at the types of complaints that people have through Glassdoor and things like that will also be super helpful, because then you can start to see like where were the people that left and maybe had negative experiences where the values were not in alignment in some way. So those are some things that I would do to be able to do that before you actually join there. But of course, being able to do some work for a couple weeks to a month with something somewhere before you actually end up being there, that's the ideal kind of model, I think. Let's see here. I've always thought that a test of good company values and product values is that employees should be able to use them to help guide difficult decisions. Yeah, I totally agree with that. If you are not, and there's one company philosophy where we would live the values, and it was amazing to be able to like hear people at least weekly inside of meetings referencing the values that we used, and we were rewarded for actually living up to those values. And so that's what I would say is like, I think it is really, really valuable for it to be a decision-making model. And it should be for the hardest decisions, we should be able to look to our values. And if we can't look to our values and we have to make special cases, that may mean that the values themselves are not as helpful as we would hope they would be. Let's see, what else is there? And let's see, I don't remember who attributed this to, but I recently heard someone argue that company values should not strive to be aspirational. It said they're autobiographical. Yeah, so actually, you know what? I think Slap makes that argument. It's either Slap or it's actually from the standpoint of the stories that you actually tell inside of the organization. I think it's actually both of them for different reasons, but this idea of like, what's the lore or the myths inside of the organization that people tell each other? That is a really amazing way to actually understand what are the values. And if you don't have those types of stories around like myths or lore, It doesn't mean you have to go out and create it, but the leaders should look for opportunities to create opportunities to do that type of thing they're they're the ones that usually have to model this type of behavior. If they can't find times to actually create more, I think that shows that maybe they're not living up to the values in the way that a leader should. And so I think that's a really interesting point. And I think actually they reference it in both the book about change and in Under the Hood, as far as like the leaders. How heavily do you rely on Glassdoor ratings and reviews? I would say it's not a lot. I mean, I think that there is a real issue that probably most people that go to Glassdoor are not going there to kind of like say good things unless their manager asks them to for some reason. I'd say probably most of the time they're they're doing it because they had a bad experience and they want to warn other people. I do think that Blind maybe does another job around this too, but I would just say like to me those are the failure cases, and so looking at the failure cases that have happened, I think are really valuable to understand like what is the way that this organization works in some way. So I think that is something that's pretty important to look at. But again, like there are lots of reasons why people may not work inside of an organization. I often think it's because of the systems that are set up around them rather than someone not wanting to do good work usually, especially when we talk about like technology jobs. But I think it's valuable to take it with a grain of salt and to look at it as like a failure case. Let's see.
Hey there, Chris. It looks
Hey,
like we are actually out of time.
okay, great. Well, thank you
Um,
everybody for all this, and I'm excited to connect on LinkedIn if people are interested. Thank you very much.